The Rebel Capitalist Show.
How can we better understand what the Fed is doing today with quantitative easing, or what they're not doing?
Yeah, well, that's a nice sort of one. Quantitative easing, when you look at it, quantitative easing is buying bonds off the banking sector. So on a regular basis, because the Federal Reserve is trying to control the short interest rate, the rate they set, there's 0% rate they have these days. It was as high as 17 under Vockler, as you and I would remember. Well, certainly I do. I think you're younger than me, aren't you?
Maybe a little bit.
There you go. Okay. Well, I was around for the Vockler recession, at least in Australia. But they're buying, the Federal Reserve is buying and selling bonds off the banks all the time, what they call open market operations, trying to maintain the interest rate within that band. So that's a regular thing to buy and sell bonds off the banks. With quantitative easing, what the Federal Reserve promised to do was to buy every month to be 80 billion on the buy side in those transactions, so that over a year it would be 1 trillion on the buy side. So it's buying $1 trillion worth of bonds off the private banks. Now, where do the private banks record their treasury bonds? As one of their assets.
Right.
Okay? So if you're buying $1 trillion worth of bonds off them, you're giving them $1 trillion in cash, which goes into the reserves. Okay? So reserves go up by $1 trillion, the bonds go down by $1 trillion. Now that's all happening on the asset side of the banking sector's ledger.
Nothing or the liability side of the Fed.
Or the liability side of the Fed, correct. But actually no, because the bonds are a liability of the Treasury.
I'm sorry, just the bank reserves on the, yeah.
Yeah. It's not, you can include the Treasury in there, as I do in more complicated models. But anyway, what it means is the operation is not, it's simply shuffling around what assets the banking sector has. It's not changing their liabilities, therefore it's not creating money. But then you have to say, well, what happens as a result of QE? Well, as a banking sector as a whole, you have 1 trillion less in bonds and 1 trillion more in cash. Now, bonds return interest rate, reserves do not. So you've traded an interest earning for a non-interest earning asset. So that is encouraging the banks, and this is deliberately part of QE, to go and buy shares.
Yeah.
Now, if they go and buy shares, they're going to drive share prices up. And you're putting $1 trillion per year more buying pressure on the share market from the banking sector, and maybe more given all the leverage that goes on there as well. So that is going to inflate share prices. Now, if people who have shares sell their shares, then they sell shares they're selling, which are their assets, get converted into cash, and that turns up on the liability side of the banking sector if that money is deposited in the bank accounts. So the appreciation of the stock market, as much as it's realised by share speculators, that's where QE's money gets into the actual banking sector. And that is a large part of why we've seen asset price bubbles. The bubble, the Fed buying the shares in the first place, people realising some of their gains there, all that, and then again you get, we all know that bankers get very handsome fees, the 2 and 20 rules. So their profits as trading corporations, that also turns up in the liability side of the banking sector. So it's a way of creating money, but it's a very weak way of doing it. You talk about a multiplier effect, put in 1, get 10 out. This is put in 10, get 1 out. It's almost like a divisor factor. So they could be getting much more bang for their buck if they gave that trillion directly to mortgagees, which they could do. So rather than getting $1 trillion in, they might get 100 billion. That does cause some growth in economic activity.
Let me just back up there really quick. So I want to put that in different terms. Instead of creating $1 trillion in base money and only getting 100 billion in broad money, you're saying they need to figure out a way, or what would be better is if they figured out a way to create the $1 trillion directly in the broad money supply, or M2, so it's circulating within the real economy instead of exclusively, or at least 90% of it, just circulating within the financial economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Michael Hudson puts it beautifully. He said that the Fed's helicopter landed on Wall Street, not Main Street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk about one of the transfer mechanisms, and this would be government spending. So we talked about if the transaction is exclusively between the Fed and the commercial banking system, then it's what our good buddy Jeff Snyder would just call an asset swap. But what happens if the government is deficit spending, and or we'll just call it that, creating or sending out checks, and then to do so, they're selling bonds that the commercial banking system buy, the primary dealer banks, and then 24 hours later, they just flip them to the Fed, and the Fed creates additional reserves to buy those treasuries that now become an asset of the Fed, but then those checks go out in the mail. So now we've got the real economy involved in what was just the financial economy between the Fed and the primary dealer bank, the commercial banking system. Now you've got those checks which become liabilities or additional deposits. So now we've created more broad money and we've created more base money. Am I thinking that through correctly?
Not quite, and that's why I recommend you get a copy of Minsky and start playing with it yourself, mate, because it's been designed for people to use, not just for me to give expertise. But I'll just go back and do share screening again.
Yeah.
And okay, so there's deficit spending. The money goes into the savers' bank accounts, and of course the reserves of the banking sector increase. So there's your deficit spending. Now let's then say we've got the sell treasury bonds to cover it. So you sell bonds to the banks, but you've got to have another account here, which I'm going to call bonds, and bonds with underscore lowercase b for the bonds itself. So if you sell the bonds, then there's going to be bonds bought by the bonds by the banks or sold to the banks. That's there, bond sales to the banks, and that's going to mean that they use reserves to do it. So, or ultimately the money comes from the reserves. So what you've got there is the selling of the treasury bonds is an asset swap. That is occurring on the asset side of the banking sector. So the deficit itself increases the liability of the banking sector. The deficit itself therefore creates money. There's no need for the central bank to come in and do anything. Now, if you include the central bank and say the central bank buys bonds off the banks, then you're going to have, well, that's going to be minus bonds which you are now buying from the banks. Okay, and that's going to mean the reserves go up. So the central bank operation also doesn't affect what's happening on the liability side of the banking sector.
So the government's spending money.
It's all just another asset swap. So the creation of money is actually the deficit itself.
Right.
Okay, and then the question is how that is actually financed in the banking, within the central bank and the treasury itself. If it's financed just by the treasury running up an overdraft on its account of the central bank, then there's no need to sell bonds in the first place.
Yeah, right.
You could simply do it that way. So all this, the bond sales do not create money, and the purchases by the central bank of bonds at the banks also do not create money. The only bond, actually I might actually illustrate this because some of my Patreon supporters had a go at me for not including this, and it turned out they were right. I hadn't including sell bonds to the public, for example.
Well, I was just going to say that, Steve. We talked about two forms of money creation with the government spending, the commercial banking system, but then I had that on my notes. What about when the banking system buys or sells assets from an entity or individual in the real economy?
Okay, well, we're going to have now, you're going to sell bonds. Now, of course, the banks are going to make a trading profit in doing that. That's the only reason they do it. So I'm going to have minus bonds sold by the banks to the public.
Yeah.
Okay, and let's say it's the savers who are doing it. Then they're going to do it by using their bank accounts. So that destroys money.
Yep.
Okay, so bond sales by the banks, or anybody really, to the non-bank public destroys money. It doesn't create money. Now, what money is it destroying? Well, it's actually destroying part of the money it's created up here. So if you had 100% sale of bonds by let's say first of all the Treasury sold all the bonds to the banking sector, which covered the deficit completely, and then the private bank sold all that to the non-bank public, there'd be no creation of money over here.
Yeah, so just putting this in as simple terms as I can. If the average listener or watcher, viewer, it has $100 in their checking account, and you buy $100 treasury from your bank, in order to pay for that, they're going to take your account balance from $100 down to
Down to
$0.
zero. Yep.
That's destroying money, because the bank isn't, that money doesn't go over to the bank at all. All they're doing is just reducing their liabilities. Now, and
Yeah.
then the opposite
Yeah.
would be true. The opposite would be true is if you sell $100 worth of treasuries to the banking system, then they would credit your deposit, your checking account, with $100. That would create additional money supply that did not exist before.
Yeah, yeah. But you've got to see it in double entry bookkeeping lens. If you don't see it through double entry bookkeeping, you're going to make a mistake. And that's why I've developed Minsky, to make it possible to do this stuff in a very careful way, with an integrated look at the entire financial system. And it gives you a very, very different vision about how the financial sector should operate than if you think of money as a liability lacking object like gold, for example.
Yeah, right.
You're going to misunderstand money.